Der Osten ist verwundbar. Wir werden vorstoßen bis zum Ural. Sieg ist unausweichlich.
By the summer of 1940, Adolf Hitler stood at what appeared to be the highest point of his power. France, the traditional continental rival that had bled Germany white in the First World War, had collapsed in a matter of weeks. Paris had fallen without the prolonged siege many had expected. The British expeditionary force had escaped at Dunkirk, but it escaped without its heavy weapons, its vehicles, and its aura of invincibility. Across Europe, governments adjusted their policies not to Berlin's wishes, but to Berlin's commands. Inside the Reich Chancellery and the Wolf's Lair, the prevailing belief was simple and intoxicating. Germany had mastered modern war. Blitzkrieg, a concept still poorly understood by Germany's enemies, seemed to have rewritten the rules of conflict. Hitler himself viewed these victories not merely as military successes, but as confirmation of his personal judgment. He had ignored cautious generals before, and reality had rewarded him. This experience would shape how he listened or did not listen to warnings that came later. At this moment, the United States barely registered as an immediate threat in Hitler's strategic thinking. America was rich, certainly industrially powerful, undeniably, but to Hitler, power unused might as well not exist. The United States had stayed out of the Great War until 1917. It had retreated again into isolationism in the 1920s and 1930s. Its army was small, its public divided, and its political system slow by design. In Hitler's mental map of the world, America was a distant giant, loud, wealthy, but hesitant to fight. This was not ignorance. Hitler read widely on American history and economics. He understood the scale of American production in abstract terms. What he did not accept was the idea that the United States could mobilize that power quickly, decisively, and with unity. He believed democracies acted late and inconsistently. Dictatorships, in his view, concentrated will and struck first. This belief had been reinforced by everything he had experienced so far. Within the German armed forces, however, not everyone shared this confidence. While the army celebrated victories on land, the Navy, the Marine, saw a different picture emerging. Germany's surface fleet was small and vulnerable. Its battleships were few, its aircraft carriers non-existent. The Battle of the Atlantic had begun quietly in 1939, and from the start it revealed Germany's limitations at sea. It was here, in this less glamorous but strategically decisive domain, that Admiral Karl Dönitz emerged as a voice of uncomfortable realism. Dönitz was not a political opponent of Hitler, nor was he a dissident in any ideological sense. He was a professional naval officer shaped by the First World War, where he had commanded submarines and spent time as a prisoner of war. That experience had left him with two lasting convictions. First, Britain had survived the earlier war not because it was unbeatable on land, but because it was supplied by sea. Second, submarines, not battleships, were the only weapon Germany possessed that could realistically threaten that lifeline. By 1940, Dönitz commanded Germany's U-boat arm. He had studied shipping statistics, convoy patterns, and industrial output with an intensity that bordered on obsession. Where Hitler thought in sweeping ideological arcs, Dönitz thought in numbers, tonnage sunk versus tonnage built, patrol days versus operational losses, fuel consumption versus replacement capacity. These calculations led him to a conclusion that clashed sharply with the prevailing optimism in Berlin. Britain, Dönitz believed, could only be defeated by strangulation, by cutting off imports of food, oil, and raw materials. But even this strategy, he warned, required a level of submarine strength Germany did not yet possess. More troubling still was the role of the United States. Even before America entered the war, its shipyards were expanding, its merchant fleet growing, and its navy escorting convoys deeper into the Atlantic under the guise of neutrality. To Dönitz, this was not a future problem. It was already happening. Within internal naval memoranda and discussions with senior officers, Dönitz argued that time was the decisive factor. If Germany did not act aggressively at sea while Britain stood alone, the window would close. American industrial power, once fully mobilized, would overwhelm any realistic German submarine campaign. This was not speculation, it was arithmetic. Hitler, however, did not view the Atlantic as the decisive arena of the war. His focus remained firmly continental. He believed Britain would eventually seek peace once it recognized the futility of resistance. He also believed that Britain's hope rested on two illusions. First, that Germany could be bled in a prolonged war. Second, that the United States would intervene decisively. Remove those illusions, Hitler thought, and British resistance would collapse. This belief shaped his response to naval warnings. Rather than seeing the United States as an emerging adversary, Hitler saw it as a psychological factor, a distant presence Britain exaggerated to maintain morale. In private conversations, he dismissed American military readiness and emphasized internal divisions within American society. He viewed President Franklin Roosevelt as hostile but constrained, unable to drag a reluctant population into war without a direct provocation. Dönitz's perspective cut directly across this world view. He was not arguing about ideology or morale. He was arguing about shipyards, steel output, and convoy escorts. To him, the war's outcome would be decided less by battlefield heroics than by whether Britain and eventually America could move material across oceans faster than Germany could sink it. In early 1941, this tension remained largely beneath the surface. Hitler still respected professional expertise, particularly when it did not openly contradict his strategic vision. Dönitz, for his part, framed his arguments carefully. He did not predict inevitable defeat. He did not challenge Hitler's authority. He warned calmly, persistently about constraints, timelines, and consequences. At the same time, Germany's leadership circle was shrinking psychologically. Success bred certainty. Each risk Hitler had taken, remilitarizing the Rhineland, annexing Austria, dismantling Czechoslovakia, striking west in 1940, had paid off. This pattern made caution seem outdated. Officers who emphasized limitations appeared unimaginative, even pessimistic. The Navy, already the smallest and least influential branch of the German armed forces, struggled to make its concerns heard in this atmosphere. Grand Admiral Erich Ardeur, head of the Kriegsmarine, still believed in surface ships and prestige fleets. Dönitz's submarine first vision competed not only with Hitler's continental focus, but also with internal naval politics. Meanwhile, the strategic horizon was shifting rapidly. Hitler was already turning his attention eastward. Plans for an attack on the Soviet Union were taking shape, driven by ideological goals and a belief that Britain's last hope lay in a future alliance with Moscow. If the Soviet Union were crushed, Hitler believed Britain would be isolated beyond recovery, regardless of American sympathy. This belief further reduced the urgency of naval warnings. The Atlantic War, in Hitler's mind, would be resolved indirectly by victories on land. The United States, watching from across the ocean, would see a dominant Germany and accept the new order rather than challenge it. Dönitz saw the opposite sequence. He believed that the longer the war lasted, the more likely American involvement became, and the more decisive that involvement would be. He did not argue that Germany could defeat the United States directly. He argued that Germany could not afford to fight it at all. By early 1941, the stage was set for a fundamental clash of perspectives. Hitler believed time worked in Germany's favor. Dönitz believed time was Germany's enemy. One man trusted momentum and will, the other trusted statistics and experience. Both were operating within the same system, loyal to the same state, yet drawing radically different conclusions about the future. This divergence would soon matter far more than either man fully realized. By the beginning of 1941, Germany's war looked victorious on the surface, but structurally fragile beneath it. This contradiction was most visible in the Battle of the Atlantic, where results were measured not in captured cities or surrendered armies, but in tonnage. Ships sunk, ships built, routes secured, routes lost. It was here that Admiral Karl Dönitz's warnings became sharper, more urgent, and increasingly uncomfortable for Adolf Hitler to hear. Dönitz's strategic thinking was shaped by a simple but ruthless calculation. Britain was an island empire. It imported the majority of its food, oil, rubber, metals, and industrial components. If those imports were cut, Britain would not merely struggle. It would collapse, but strangulation at sea required overwhelming force at the right moment. Dönitz had calculated that Germany needed at least 300 operational U-boat to break Britain decisively. In early 1941, he had barely a third of that number, and many were outdated or constantly under repair. The problem was not just quantity, it was time. Every month that passed allowed British anti-submarine tactics to improve and American involvement to deepen. Even before formally entering the war, the United States was expanding its navy, escorting convoys, sharing intelligence, and supplying Britain through Lend-Lease. To dit, American neutrality was already a fiction. The Atlantic was becoming an Anglo-American operational space, while Germany fought with limited resources and divided priorities. Dönitz communicated these concerns through formal channels, reports, conferences, and direct discussions with senior leadership. His tone was professional, not defiant. He did not accuse Hitler of ignorance. He simply laid out the facts. American shipbuilding capacity once mobilized would dwarf German submarine production. Losses that Germany could not replace quickly would be replaced by the United States almost effortlessly. In one internal assessment, Dönitz emphasized that the war against Britain was fundamentally an industrial contest disguised as a naval one. Sink too few ships and Britain survives. Sink enough ships, but too slowly, and America compensates. The margin for error was narrow, and Germany was already drifting outside it. Hitler's reaction to these assessments revealed a deeper difference in how he understood war. Hitler believed wars were decided by will, shock, and decisive blows, not prolonged attrition. He had little patience for strategies that depended on years of sustained pressure without visible victories. Submarine warfare, invisible to the public and slow in its effects, lacked the dramatic clarity he preferred. More importantly, Hitler believed he had found a faster solution to Britain, one that made Dönitz's warnings seem secondary. That solution was the Soviet Union. By early 1941, Hitler was convinced that Britain remained in the war, not because it believed it could defeat Germany alone, but because it expected help from others, particularly the United States and the Soviet Union. If Germany destroyed the Soviet Union in a rapid campaign, Britain would lose its last potential continental ally. In Hitler's thinking, Britain would then be forced to negotiate regardless of American sympathy. This belief fundamentally shaped his response to naval strategy. Resources were finite. Steel, fuel, labor, and industrial capacity had to be allocated. Hitler chose to prioritize the army for Operation Barbarossa, the planned invasion of the Soviet Union. Tanks, trucks, artillery, and rail logistics consumed the lion's share of Germany's industrial output. The Navy, already the weakest branch, was pushed further down the priority list. Dönitz watched this with growing concern. From his perspective, Germany was making the same mistake it had made in the First World War, fighting a continental war while neglecting the maritime dimension that ultimately decided the outcome. But unlike many critics, Dönitz did not oppose the invasion of the Soviet Union on ideological grounds. His objection was strategic sequencing. Germany, he believed, was opening a second colossal front before resolving the first. In meetings with Grand Admiral Erich R. Durr and other naval leaders, Dönitz argued that the Atlantic War should be treated as decisive, not auxiliary. Raeder, however, remained committed to surface ships and prestige projects such as battleships that consumed enormous resources while offering limited strategic return. Hitler, influenced by Raeder's arguments and his own fascination with symbolic power, approved these projects even as U-boat production lagged. This internal naval division weakened Dönitz's position further. He was not only arguing against Hitler's world, but also against entrenched institutional priorities within his own service. Meanwhile, the United States continued to move closer to active involvement. American destroyers escorted convoys farther east. German U-boat were increasingly constrained by rules of engagement that attempted to avoid provoking Washington outright. Each such restriction frustrated Dönitz, who saw it as strategic paralysis disguised as diplomacy. Hitler, however, viewed the United States primarily through a political lens. He believed President Roosevelt was maneuvering toward war, but he also believed Roosevelt was constrained by Congress, public opinion, and America's democratic process. Hitler assumed that unless Germany directly attacked American forces or territory, the United States would hesitate to commit fully. This assumption underestimated both American industrial momentum and political resolve. It also underestimated how quickly circumstances at sea could escalate beyond diplomatic control. By mid-1941, Dönitz's warnings had become less about possibility and more about inevitability. He no longer spoke merely of what Germany should do to win. He increasingly focused on what Germany must do to avoid catastrophic imbalance, yet his language remained careful. He did not predict defeat openly. Within the Nazi system, pessimism was dangerous. Officers who framed reality too bluntly risked being sidelined or dismissed. Hitler, for his part, did not fire Dönitz or silence him, but he also did not act on his most urgent recommendations. Instead, he postponed, deferred, and diluted them. Submarine production increased, but not at the scale or speed Dönitz demanded. Strategic focus remained divided. The Atlantic War continued, but without the concentration necessary to deliver decisive results before American power fully entered the field. In June 1941, Germany invaded the Soviet Union. For Hitler, this was the decisive gamble that would render all other strategic concerns irrelevant. For Dönitz, it marked the moment when Germany's margin for error narrowed to almost nothing. From that point forward, the war's structure changed irreversibly. Britain gained breathing room. American support accelerated. German submarines fought bravely and effectively, but against an opponent whose capacity for adaptation and production grew with each passing month. Dönitz had not been ignored completely, but he had not been believed in time. When the United States formally entered the war in December 1941, the strategic reality Admiral Karl Dönitz had warned about for years became unavoidable. What followed in early 1942 appeared at first glance to vindicate Hitler's dismissive confidence rather than Dönitz's caution. German U-boat achieved one of their most dramatic periods of success along the American eastern seaboard. A phase known to the Germans as Operation Palanslag, the second happy time. From January through the summer of 1942, German submarines sank American and Allied merchant ships at an alarming rate. Coastal cities in the United States left their lights on at night. Ships sailed without convoys. Anti-submarine coordination was poor, fragmented, and slow to adapt. To many in Berlin, these early successes seemed to confirm that America was unprepared for modern war, just as Hitler had believed. But to Dönitz, the picture looked very different. He welcomed the operational success, but he did not misread it. He understood that these sinkings, impressive as they were, did not resolve the underlying imbalance. They were exploiting temporary weaknesses, not permanent ones. American shipyards were already expanding at unprecedented speed. New escort vessels were being launched faster than Germany could sink them. Radar, sonar, and air patrol coverage were improving month by month. Dönitz warned that the apparent triumph masked a looming reversal. Hitler, however, interpreted the events of 1942 through a psychological lens rather than a structural one. He saw American losses as proof that the United States was vulnerable, inexperienced, and overconfident. In private conversations, he mocked American naval preparedness and suggested that the shock of submarine warfare would undermine American morale before its industrial power could be fully applied. This difference in interpretation deepened the gap between Hitler and his naval commander. Dönitz pushed relentlessly for more submarines, better crews, and technological innovation. He emphasized the need to strike relentlessly before American defenses solidified. Yet, even at the height of U-boat success, Germany was losing experienced crews at a rate it could not afford. Each lost submarine represented not just steel and machinery, but years of training that could not be replaced quickly. At the same time, Germany's overall strategic position was deteriorating elsewhere. The Eastern Front, initially envisioned as a swift campaign, had become a vast war of attrition. Resources were being consumed at staggering rates. Fuel shortages worsened. Aircraft production was strained. Every additional submarine required steel, engines, and skilled labor that were also desperately needed by the Army and Air Force. This competition for resources increasingly shaped Hitler's decisions. The Navy, despite its successes, music remained a secondary priority. Hitler continued to believe that decisive outcomes would come from land campaigns, not prolonged maritime pressure. In January 1943, Grand Admiral Erich R. resigned as Commander-in-Chief of the Marine. Frustrated by Hitler's strategic interference and the Navy's declining influence, Hitler replaced him with Karl Dönitz. On the surface, this appeared to be a triumph for the submarine advocate. Dönitz now held the highest naval position in Germany. If ever there was a moment when his vision could be fully implemented, this was it. Yet, the promotion came too late. By the time Dönitz assumed command, the balance in the Atlantic had already begun to shift. Allied convoy systems were standardized. Long-range aircraft closed the air gap in the mid-Atlantic. New technologies, improved sonar, radar, and depth-charge tactics music dramatically increased U-boat losses. Where German submarines had once hunted with relative freedom, they now faced layered defenses that reduced their effectiveness and survival chances. Dönitz recognized the danger immediately. He ordered tactical adjustments, redeployments, and technological experimentation, including the development of new submarine designs intended to restore the initiative. But innovation required time, the very resource Germany no longer had. Hitler, meanwhile, reacted to mounting losses with increasing detachment from operational reality. He oscillated between blaming commanders for insufficient aggressiveness and insisting that new wonder weapons would soon reverse the situation. This pattern was not unique to naval warfare, but it was particularly destructive at sea, where adaptation depended on sober assessment rather than ideological confidence. The core tragedy of 1942-43 lay in the illusion of success. Germany's early victories against American shipping created a false sense of strategic momentum. They delayed hard decisions and reinforced Hitler's belief that the United States could be worn down psychologically before its material strength became decisive. Dönitz did not share this illusion. His private assessments became increasingly grim. He understood that even if U-boat continued to sink ships at a high rate, Allied production would outpace losses. The war at sea was no longer about sinking ships faster than they could be built. It was about whether Germany could survive the escalating asymmetry of resources. By mid-1943, U-boat losses reached catastrophic levels. Entire patrols failed to return. Veteran commanders were lost. The Atlantic, once a hunting ground, became a killing field. Dönitz was forced to withdraw many submarines from active operations, a decision that amounted to acknowledging defeat in the central naval struggle of the war. Hitler, who had once dismissed American naval power as slow and indecisive, now faced a reality he could not undo. The United States had not only mobilized, it had transformed the strategic environment faster than Germany could adapt. Dönitz had warned of this outcome years earlier, not as prophecy, but as projection. By 1943, the war Admiral Karl Dönitz had tried to prevent was fully underway and unfolding exactly as he had feared. The Atlantic was no longer a contested space. It was increasingly an Allied-controlled system of routes, bases, air cover, and industrial pipelines stretching from North America to Britain and beyond. Germany was still fighting, still sinking ships, still deploying submarines, but the strategic equation had irreversibly shifted. For Dönitz, now commander-in-chief of the Marine, the situation was brutally clear. The Battle of the Atlantic was being lost not because German sailors lacked courage or skill, but because Germany had entered an industrial war it could not mathematically win. Every operational decision he made was constrained by realities that no longer allowed for decisive outcomes. Hitler, however, did not fully internalize this shift. By this stage of the war, Hitler's leadership style had hardened. He no longer tolerated strategic debate in the way he had earlier. Conferences became one-sided. Reports that emphasized limitations or irreversible trends were treated as expressions of defeatism rather than professional analysis. Successes, even minor or temporary ones, were seized upon as proof that perseverance would eventually bring reversal. Dönitz found himself in an impossible position. As head of the Navy, he was responsible for executing Hitler's orders. As a professional officer, he understood that those orders were increasingly detached from reality. The technological race at sea illustrated this tension perfectly. German engineers were developing advanced submarine designs, including boats capable of longer submerged operations and higher underwater speeds. These innovations, particularly the later Type 21 concept, had the potential to challenge Allied anti-submarine dominance. But development, testing, and mass production required time, stability, and uninterrupted industrial capacity. Germany had none of these. Allied bombing campaigns targeted shipyards, engine factories, and transportation networks. Skilled labor was scarce, fuel shortages disrupted training and deployment. Even when new boats were completed, crews often lacked sufficient preparation. The theoretical advantage of advanced technology was eroded by the practical chaos of a collapsing war economy. Dönitz repeatedly emphasized that deploying untested systems prematurely would only lead to further losses. Yet pressure from Hitler and the broader leadership demanded action, visible action regardless of readiness. The same pattern that plagued German tank and aircraft programs now applied to submarines. Prototypes were rushed, flaws overlooked, and expectations inflated. At the same time, Allied coordination reached levels Germany could not match. British and American naval forces operated as a unified system. Intelligence sharing, particularly through signals interception, allowed convoys to be routed away from U-boat concentrations. Air coverage extended across previously vulnerable zones. Escort carriers brought aircraft directly into submarine hunting areas. To Dönitz, this integration was decisive. It confirmed his long-held belief that Germany's enemies, once fully mobilized, would combine resources in ways Germany could not counter. The Atlantic War had become not a contest of tactics, but of systems, and Germany's system was breaking down. Hitler's response to this reality was increasingly abstract. Rather than adjusting strategy, he reframed objectives. Instead of defeating Britain or cutting Atlantic supply lines decisively, success was redefined as endurance. If Germany could hold out long enough, Hitler believed, political fractures might appear among the Allies. The United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union were ideologically incompatible. He argued their alliance was temporary and artificial. This belief replaced strategic calculation with political hope. Dönitz did not openly challenge this assumption. By 1943-44, the Nazi leadership structure no longer allowed for meaningful dissent, but his internal assessments reflected a stark conclusion. The naval war could no longer alter the course of the conflict. At best, it could delay defeat. At worst, it consumed resources desperately needed elsewhere. This realization shaped some of his most difficult decisions. Submarine deployments were reduced. Patrol areas were adjusted away from heavily defended zones. Losses were acknowledged internally even when public statements emphasized resilience. The Marine continued to fight, but without the expectation of strategic reversal. Hitler interpreted these adjustments as lack of aggressiveness. He pushed for renewed offensives at sea, just as he demanded offensives on land despite overwhelming odds. The logic was consistent. Initiative itself was seen as victory regardless of outcome. The disconnect between perception and reality widened further in 1944. Allied landings in Normandy confirmed what Dönitz had already understood, that Allied control of the seas enabled operations Germany could not prevent. The invasion was not just a tactical defeat. It was proof of systemic failure. The Atlantic supply network Dönitz had warned about years earlier had matured into an unstoppable force. German submarines attempted to disrupt invasion logistics, but with minimal effect. Allied escorts, air cover, and rapid repair capabilities neutralized the threat. The U-boat arm, once Germany's most feared weapon, was now strategically marginal. Hitler's faith in late-war technological miracles persisted. He spoke of new submarines, new weapons, and new methods that would soon restore balance. Dönitz, while overseeing some of these programs, understood their limitations. Even if technically successful, they could not be deployed in sufficient numbers soon enough to matter. The core tragedy of this phase was not ignorance but timing. The strategic concepts Dönitz had advocated were not wrong. Concentrated submarine warfare early in the war might have produced decisive effects. But implemented late under bombardment and resource collapse, those same ideas became gestures rather than solutions. By late 1944, the question was no longer whether Germany could defeat the United States at sea. It was whether Germany could survive at all. The naval war had ceased to be a path to victory and had become a record of missed opportunities. Dönitz remained loyal to the regime and continued to execute his duties. But the professional clarity that had once driven his warnings now framed his understanding of the end. The United States had not only entered the war, it had reshaped it entirely. Hitler had not fired the admiral who warned him in time. He had promoted him when it no longer mattered. By early 1945, the war Adolf Hitler had once believed he controlled had collapsed into fragments. Militarily, economically, and psychologically, Germany's cities were burning under sustained bombing. Its armies were retreating on every front, and its allies had either surrendered or defected. The Atlantic War, once imagined as a path to forcing Britain into submission or deterring the United States, had become a closed chapter. The outcome was no longer in doubt. It was in this terminal phase of the Third Reich that the full irony of Karl Dönitz's career reached its peak. Dönitz had not been removed when his warnings were most relevant. He had not been dismissed when he argued that American industrial power would decide the war. Instead, he had been elevated first to commander-in-chief of the Navy, and then, after Hitler's suicide in April 1945, to Hitler's successor as head of state of Germany. The admiral who had warned that Germany could not afford war with the United States was now responsible for managing the final collapse of a state that had lost exactly that war. By this stage, Hitler's relationship with military reality had almost completely broken down. Strategic conferences devolved into ritual affirmations of loyalty rather than meaningful planning. Commanders were blamed for defeats rooted in material impossibility. Geography, logistics, and numbers were treated as obstacles that could be overcome through willpower alone. Naval matters barely registered in Hitler's final months. Germany no longer possessed the means to challenge Allied sea power in any meaningful way. Submarines still sailed, but they operated in an environment dominated by Allied air patrols, sonar nets, and overwhelming escort forces. Sinkings occurred, but they had no strategic effect. Dönitz's role during this period was administrative rather than visionary. He oversaw the remnants of a navy that could neither influence events nor protect the German coastline from blockade and bombardment. His internal communications focused increasingly on preservation rather than victory, saving crews where possible, avoiding unnecessary losses, and maintaining order in a collapsing command structure. This pragmatic approach contrasted sharply with Hitler's increasingly detached expectations. Hitler demanded resistance everywhere regardless of cost or feasibility. He forbade retreats, ordered counterattacks without reserves, and continued to speak of reversals that had no basis in reality. Dönitz did not publicly challenge these orders. The system no longer allowed it, but his actions reflected a quieter understanding of the inevitable. Unlike Hitler, he did not believe time would deliver miracles. He believed time had already run out. The most consequential moment came after Hitler's death on April 30th, 1945. In his political testament, Hitler named Karl Dönitz as Reich President, separating the roles of head of state and head of government for the first time. This choice was revealing. Hitler did not select a party ideologue or a political loyalist. He selected a professional officer, disciplined, orderly, and pragmatic. Dönitz's priorities as leader were fundamentally different from Hitler's. He did not seek to prolong the war for symbolic reasons. His central objective was to end the conflict in a way that minimized further destruction and loss of life, particularly for German civilians and soldiers attempting to surrender to Western Allied forces rather than the Soviet Union. This decision reflected the same strategic realism that had shaped his earlier warnings. He understood power relationships, he understood industrial imbalance, and he understood that Germany had no leverage left. Under Dönitz's brief leadership, the remaining German forces were instructed to cease offensive operations where possible and facilitate surrender in the West. Naval units were ordered to stop combat operations shortly before the general capitulation. These actions did not reverse defeat, but they shaped how defeat unfolded. In this final phase, the contrast between Hitler's worldview and Dönitz could not have been sharper. Hitler had believed that war was decided by belief and resolve, even in the absence of material capacity. Dönitz believed war was decided by resources, systems, and time, and that once those were exhausted, continuation served no strategic purpose. The firing implied by history's judgment did not come through an official dismissal. Hitler never formally removed Dönitz for his earlier warnings. Instead, reality itself delivered the verdict. Every prediction Dönitz had made about the United States, its production, its adaptability, its ability to dominate the Atlantic had come true. The tragedy was not that Hitler ignored expertise entirely. It was that he recognized it too late. By the time Dönitz's perspective shaped policy, there was nothing left to shape. Germany's defeat was not caused by a single decision or personality, but the failure to align strategy with material reality, particularly regarding the United States, proved decisive. The war at sea had been the hinge on which global power turned, and Germany had entered that contest underprepared and overconfident. Dönitz's career ended not in vindication, but in management of collapse. His warnings were historically accurate, strategically sound, and ultimately irrelevant to the outcome. Not because they were wrong, but because they were not acted upon when action still mattered. When the war ended in May 1945, the ruins of Germany told a story far larger than any single battle or leader. Cities lay flattened, industries shattered, and millions displaced. Yet behind the physical destruction lay a deeper strategic failure, one that had been visible years earlier to those willing to measure power honestly. Among them was Admiral Karl Dönitz, whose warnings about the United States were not dramatic predictions, but sober conclusions drawn from numbers, logistics, and experience. History would later strip away the myths that surrounded the Third Reich's downfall. Germany did not lose because its soldiers lacked bravery. It did not lose because its weapons were inferior in design. And it did not lose because a single admiral was ignored or a single decision went wrong. Germany lost because it entered a global industrial war against an opponent whose economic capacity, once mobilized, was fundamentally beyond its reach. The United States represented a type of power Hitler never truly understood. Hitler viewed strength primarily through the lens of will, ideology, and decisive action. His successes before and during the early years of the war reinforced this worldview. He believed that enemies collapsed when confronted with speed, shock, and psychological dominance. This belief worked against France. It worked against smaller European states. It even worked temporarily against Britain on land. But the United States did not operate on the same logic. American power was slow to awaken, but once activated, it was systemic. It was not built around a single campaign or theater, but around production lines, training pipelines, logistics networks, and global coordination. Shipyards launched vessels faster than Germany could destroy them. Aircraft factories delivered planes in numbers that overwhelmed qualitative differences. Training programs replaced losses at a pace Germany could not match. Dönitz had understood this early. His assessments were not based on admiration for the United States, nor fear, but realism. He saw that submarine warfare could only succeed if it delivered decisive results before American mobilization reached full scale. Once that threshold was crossed, the balance would shift permanently. That is exactly what happened. The Battle of the Atlantic became the clearest demonstration of this imbalance. Germany's U-boat arm fought with determination and tactical skill, but it was drawn into a contest of endurance. Every submarine lost weakened Germany disproportionately. Every Allied ship lost was absorbed by production schedules already accelerating beyond wartime precedent. By 1943, the outcome was no longer uncertain. Allied control of the seas enabled operations that Germany could neither prevent nor counter. From the sustained bombing of German industry to the landings in Italy and Normandy, sea power was not a supporting element of victory. It was the foundation on which all other Allied successes rested. Hitler's failure was not ignorance of American strength in theory. He spoke often of America's wealth and scale. His failure lay in dismissing how quickly that potential could be converted into military reality and how completely it would dominate once unleashed. Dönitz's firing, implied in the title of this story, did not occur in a literal sense. Hitler never removed him for warning about the United States. Instead, the true firing was strategic marginalization. Dönitz's analysis was acknowledged but postponed. Respected, but not prioritized until circumstances rendered it irrelevant. This distinction matters. The narrative of villain and hero oversimplifies history. Dönitz was not a moral opponent of the Nazi regime, nor a savior figure. He was a loyal officer who believed in Germany's cause while recognizing its limits. Hitler was not irrational in every respect. Many of his early decisions were calculated and effective. The tragedy lay in the widening gap between ideological belief and material reality. Once that gap became too large, no amount of resolve could bridge it. After the war, historians examining German archives found that many of the regime's internal assessments acknowledged the same constraints Dönitz had identified. Reports spoke of fuel shortages, production bottlenecks, and training deficits, yet these acknowledgments rarely translated into strategic restraint. Germany continued to expand commitments while its capacity to sustain them shrank. The United States, by contrast, aligned strategy with capacity. It chose theaters carefully, coordinated allies effectively, and ensured that operations were supported by overwhelming logistical depth. Victory was not dependent on flawless execution, but on structural advantage. This is why the question embedded in this story is ultimately larger than any individual. Can belief overcome imbalance? In Germany's case, the answer was no. The war demonstrated that modern conflict is not decided solely by courage or genius, but by systems, economic, industrial, and organizational. Germany excelled at innovation and tactical brilliance. The United States excelled at scale, sustainability, and adaptation. Once those strengths were fully engaged, the outcome became inevitable. Dönitz's legacy, therefore, is not one of triumph or redemption. It is a case study in accurate analysis constrained by political reality. He identified the decisive factor of the war, American industrial power, and warned that Germany could not outlast it. History proved him correct, but correctness did not equal influence. Hitler's legacy in this context is not simply one of miscalculation, but of selective understanding. He recognized strength when it appeared in dramatic form. He underestimated strength when it appeared slowly, bureaucratically, and without spectacle. The collapse of Nazi Germany closed this chapter definitively. The United States emerged not only victorious, but transformed into the central global power of the post-war world. A position secured as much in shipyards and factories as on battlefields. In the end, the admiral who warned about America did not lose an argument. He lost a race against time.